Bolivia's bitter police strike is over, but there's more trouble for President Evo Morales as more than 1,000 indigenous protesters march on the capital, angry with his government. So what does it mean for the Morales presidency? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. It was a bitter dispute which saw hundreds of Bolivian police officers protest outside the presidential palace in a demand for higher wages. And amid the acrimony, Bolivia's President Evo Morales, while thanking his supporters, also accused the strikers of setting the stage for an attempted coup.
Many thanks to all of you for your rapid reflection and condemnation of this attempt to carry out a coup. We will document on another day how they were trying to organise it. When they can't do it, they say there was no attempt to do a coup. They are experts at lying and causing confusion, but they are not going to fool us with the lies, brothers and sisters.
Earlier on Wednesday, after a week of strikes, a deal appeared to have been reached, bringing officers' base pay roughly in line with other public sector employees. But it's not the end of the president's problems. Also on Wednesday, more than 1,000 indigenous protesters were aiming to complete a 600-kilometre march on the capital, La Paz. It's part of a long-running dispute over a planned highway through their ancestral homeland. It follows months of social unrest in the country from miners, doctors and others frustrated at the low standard of living. So what does it mean for Evo Morales, Latin America's first indigenous president, who overwhelmingly won 2 elections on a platform of transforming the fortunes of the poorest of South America's worst-off country? Earlier, I spoke to Pablo Solon, who served under Morales as Bolivia's ambassador to the United Nations. He recently wrote an open letter to the president regarding the Amazon highway protesters, urging Morales to do more for indigenous groups. I began by asking him whether the police strike and the indigenous marches show that opposition to President Morales is widening.
Of course, it's reflecting that there is a conflict inside Bolivia. I wouldn't say that they are part of a coup d'etat, as many have said. I think that both have to do with 2 unresolved issues. The police was asking for an increase in their salaries, and the conflict has been solved today in the morning when they managed to have an increase of 22% in their basic salary. And the march of the Tignes is marching for a second time to stop the road that's going to cut the heart of this national park that's called the Tignes. So these 2 processes have to do with very concrete demands, one in relation to social demands and the other in relation to indigenous rights and what we call here in our country Mother Earth rights, the rights of nature.
Okay, if we look at the bigger picture here, it's apparent that something has gone wrong in the way President Evo Morales is running the country, because there was so much hope that he would champion the indigenous peoples, he himself is indigenous, and that he would champion the causes and rights of low-income workers. That doesn't seem to have worked out that way.
I think that there has been some kind of contradiction between what we wanted to do and what we have really achieved. We have a very strong discourse and a very good proposal, but this in many circumstances has not been put into practice.
Why do you think there are these contradictions that have arisen in Bolivia? I mean, is the government under President Morales under pressure from some quarters?
I think that inside the Bolivian government there are 2 tendencies. One that says we must follow up the traditional development model, and there is another one that says no, we have to follow up a new paradigm that is not the traditional development of just more roads, more industrialization, but what we call here vivir bien, living well, not only in harmony between humans, but between humans and nature.
So how damaging are the protests in Bolivia to President Morales? With me to discuss this are Kathryn Ledebur, the Executive Director of the Andean Information Network, Sanho Tree, a Latin America security analyst from the Institute for Policy Studies, and also joining us, Farnsworth, the Vice President of the Council of the Americas. Thanks to all of you for joining us. First, let's start with the police strike, which up to now appears to have been resolved. Kathryn, did the police have a case in the first place?
Well, I think they did have a case in terms of a salary that was 30% lower than the salary perceived by the armed forces, a lack of Morales' investment in infrastructure, some very real economic needs, and some legitimate complaints. At the same time, I think there were other issues that played into this. One, the traditional friction between the armed forces and the military competition, friction between the police force and Morales' administration over responsibility for human rights violations, and a series of other issues such as the Morales administration's decision to change how promotions are made that caused this to come to a head. I think there are legitimate demands, I think there are political demands. It's always a combination of complex factors in a Bolivian protest.
All right, well, let's take a look at some of the police officers' reactions to this deal with the government. Here's a sample of what we've heard. Let's take a look.
We feel betrayed by the signed deal. We do not agree with what they signed with the government. There is disagreement in the force. They should have given us $30 more a month, and now they are only giving us $15.
The agreement has been greeted with resignation. Nobody agrees. A lot of people have told us this, but we accepted it with resignation because the salary negotiations were tough.
Well, the views there of some of the police officers after that settlement was reached. Let's go to Sanho Tree. Sanho, what do you make of the fact that the government of Evo Morales alleged that right-wing forces had infiltrated the police, that there was a coup in the making here?
I don't know the details of that, but the problem is when you have these forces that are trained to carry out certain missions, for instance, the drug war or the war on gangs, not necessarily in Bolivia, but in other countries, what happens if you don't pay them enough? They know your sources and methods, they know how to operate, how law enforcement operates, and they're in a position to cause a lot of trouble. If you don't pay them enough, they can be hired by organized crime or other groups to carry out their interests. So it's the boomerang of the security assistance that we provide in the United States, that we create these institutions that become very problematic in the long run when they boomerang back.
Eric, what do you make of the fact that, here was the president and his aides and his supporters there saying that this was a coup in the making? Is this sort of par for the course, standard?
It is. I don't see it as a coup in the making. I see it as a labor action. The police were disappointed with their low level of salaries relative to some of their peers. They were also disappointed with a very harsh disciplinary code that was being forced through, and frankly they just didn't want to accept it. So they took this labor action. It doesn't seem to be instigated from anybody from the outside or anybody trying to make mischief at a national political level, but simply this is the way that they felt that their demands could be heard, and so they took to the streets. I think the question is, what will this do over the longer term? I don't see it as an extortion mechanism of the government, but the fact is they did win some concessions, and the question will be, are there other sectors of society that also have similar grievances, perhaps, in a country where the president said that there would be a much greater standard of living, etc., and raised expectations that really haven't been met. And so what does that mean for other sectors of society? And that remains to be seen.
Yeah. Kathryn, you mentioned something earlier on, and that's the differences between the military and the police, and the fact that they are paid these two different salaries. Does that aggravate the differences between them? And does it cause friction in terms of the way the country is administered and the way, the law is enforced?
Yes, I think that's a very, very important point. And these two institutions have always been rivals. This rivalry, as Sanho mentioned, was exacerbated by a whole process during the period of the U.S.-funded drug war, where the police force got military training and the military were given an unconstitutional law enforcement role in coca eradication. It's important to remember that institutional friction in Bolivia came to a head in 2003 when President Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada sent the military out against the police, and there was literally a shootout in front of the Capitol building where more than 23 people were killed. So there is institutional institutional friction. There is a bad history. There has been a decision on the part of the Morales administration to prize the armed forces in their discourse in terms of how the budget is destined to build up military infrastructure to give them greater benefits than the police force. And this is something that has made the police force very resentful. At the same time, with the conviction of high-ranking Sanchez de Lozada, ministers, and his military high command for human rights violations, the military have made the decision to not go out on the streets against the Bolivian people. This is something that is a correct decision. These actions led to many violations in the past, but at the same time, it means the police are going out. Human rights violations occur, not at the level that they did in 2003, but then they themselves face prosecution. So it's a very complex situation between the institutions, and the relationship with the police and the Morales administration has always been very antagonistic. At the same time, I agree that the accusations that a coup was being planned are not at all founded. I think it's a traditional Bolivian tactic to try to mobilize support against the movement, but at the same time, the level of credibility of the Bolivian police is so low with the Bolivian people that it would have been impossible for them to actually gain popular support. You didn't have a grassroots swell of support for the police because they don't feel that, Bolivian people don't feel that they've been served well by their law enforcement institution.
Yeah, and I think that tactic that you talk about, you know, at least portraying the police as challenging the authority of the state, that's been used in other South American countries as well, hasn't it? In Colombia as well.
I think it's been used in most Latin American countries. I think it's a catchphrase.
Yeah. Sanho, when we look at the role of the police in Bolivia, you know, one of the arguments that has arisen as we listen to both sides of this debate is that the police have become just simply guardians of public institutions, and the other is that they're law enforcement officers. What are they?
This is the problem. I believe in strong and effective law enforcement, but the laws have to be viewed as legitimate and just by the majority of the people. And if you have things like the war on drugs, which disproportionately punishes people for being poor, essentially, and has these draconian sentences, much of which was sponsored by the United States, then people lose faith in these institutions, and you have a legitimation crisis. It opens up the avenues for corruption, where the police can plant drugs on people, for instance, or extort money from people. People have to have faith in their law enforcement institutions, and I think the drug war is something that just corrupts that essential bond, that trust.
And Eric, that brings us to another point, and that is the drug war in Bolivia. I mean, does the state allocate too many resources to that war?
Well, that's a decision for the Bolivian people, to be honest. Certainly the amount of resources that have been allocated in cooperation with other partners like Brazil, like the United States, like others, has varied over time. The fact of the matter is that many people in Bolivia have rejected what's euphemistically called the war on drugs, but the problems haven't been resolved and they haven't been solved. The problem is if you reject sort of the idea that drugs need to be attacked in some way, but don't replace it with anything, then all you're doing is creating a vacuum where actually the drug culture flourishes. Now, Bolivia has a very strong and traditional and appropriate in some ways aspect of the indigenous use of coca and the use of coca leaf, but that is totally different from moving cocaine across borders into international markets. And it's that dilemma that the Bolivian government has traditionally had to struggle with. In fact, President Morales is himself a product of the coca industry and a leader of the Coca Growers Union. And in fact, the impression and the image of coca is much different in Bolivia than it is in the United States, in Brazil, in Europe. And so you have a real divergence of views in terms of what level is appropriate and what amount of authority or attention should be paid to reducing the coca trade. It's an open question, and I don't think anybody's come up with the right answer just yet.
If I can add something quickly, you know, one of the portions of the budget crisis that exists is the large amount of money that the U.S. used to pay for drug interdiction to go after the cocaine portion. That amount has disappeared quickly since the expulsion of Ambassador Goldberg and the expulsion of the DEA in January of 2009. The Bolivian government has chosen to replace this with $20 million of their own funds. So the great bulk now of their anti-drug budget is paid by the Bolivian Treasury. That was a conscious decision to have greater control over the decision-making process. And I think that they are working very, very hard in terms of interdiction to try to capture drug shipments. There are more officers than they are, but they're on a shoestring budget. At the same time, I think we need to look at the difficulties that this creates. One, you have a very, very small budget, this drains budget from the larger police force. You have an elite force that is sucking budget from other parts of the institution. That generates internal friction. And the credibility of these officers and the regular police force with the population, because of what actually continues to be a very directed interdiction method, kind of what the DEA did without the DEA, and often this can create greater problems, has not led to greater credibility of the police force. So it's a balancing act that the Morales administration goes to, and at the same time I think that we have to realistically understand that police action or police work in interdiction is not going to effectively limit the drug trade. The drug trade is effectively limited when you attack the consumption of cocaine or the demand, and that's almost entirely outside of Bolivia.
You mentioned public opinion earlier on. Where does public opinion fall on things like this police strike, or is there sympathy for the police?
I think that there is not sympathy for the police. I think there's recognition that they're poorly paid. I think there's a great deal of frustration about the high level of corruption, the inefficacy of the police. It's commentaries of we don't know whether we're safer on the street with the police or without the police. But the two things feed into each other. I like to say that the Bolivian police force has gotten a raw deal for generations from the Bolivian government, but at the same time the Bolivian people have gotten a raw deal from the Bolivian police for generations. So it's a kind of a vicious cycle, and the Morales administration has made some attempts at reform, but nothing that's very profound. It's not the police reform is an easy thing. But I think that they've been symbolic efforts, or they have been punitive. For example, taking away a key source of income from giving out ID cards or driver's licenses, or a new disciplinary system that the police attacked. It's interesting that the institutions they sacked first in the mutiny were they burned all the disciplinary files, and they took over the headquarters of the civilian ID card thing. So it's about money, it's about control, it's about sustenance.
Okay, let's actually take a look at some numbers in Bolivia. It is the poorest country in South America. In fact, police officers are relatively better off in a country where the official minimum wage level is $116. More than half of Bolivians are poor, while 1/4 are extremely poor. But poverty levels have fallen substantially after Evo Morales became president in 2006. In 2005, 60% of Bolivians were poor, while 38% were extremely poor. Eric, let's get to the other challenge facing the president right now. That is the march by indigenous people who are protesting the proposed construction of this highway through their ancestral lands. Is there a feeling that Evo Morales, the first indigenous president elected in Latin America, has actually betrayed his own people?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. Betrayal is a pretty strong word, but the fact is that there was an expectation, perhaps, that he would have a different approach. And this is where his background as a leader of the coca movement perhaps comes in contrast with his role as the first indigenous president of Bolivia, because you have the coca industry coming up against the needs of the indigenous population in this nature preserve that's actually being targeted for development. Bolivia, it's really interesting. Bolivia is a very divided society traditionally. This goes back a long time. It predates Evo Morales. It's divided geographically. It's divided in terms of the indigenous versus the European background. It's divided in terms of wealth and wealth creation, wealth generation. And so there are a lot of different and divergent views here in terms of where Bolivia should be going. But one thing that President Morales did when he came in and was first elected president, he said the quality of life is going to improve. And so there were these expectations from not all sectors, but many sectors, that in fact their lives would improve.
Did he set those expectations too high?
Well, I think you can make that case, and I would say so. And what happened is a lot of people expected that their lives would improve, and that they would improve courtesy of the government, because they looked to the government for benefits, whether it be conditional cash transfers, whether it be some sort of job creation program or public works, etc. And when those jobs didn't materialize, or the benefits from existing jobs jabs didn't increase, then there was a certain disaffection that has set in throughout the country. And when people get dissatisfied with their current circumstances, then those divisions that have previously existed can begin to come again to the surface. And I think that's one thing that we're seeing, particularly in the context of the indigenous movement in Bolivia.
Okay. Sanho, you know, Eric here mentioned that Bolivia is a divided society. How divided a society is Bolivia?
It's so ironic that Evo Morales is in a unique position to understand this problem from both sides. As a cocalero, as an organizer in these social movements, he was very much a victim and understands what it's like to be on the receiving end of repression from state security forces. A friend of mine ran into Evo Morales about a dozen years ago at the La Paz airport, for instance. He had just returned from Libya, where he received the Gaddafi Peace Prize. But he wore the same change of clothes for several days, and he smelled very, very pungent. And my friend asked him, "Why didn't you bring any luggage? What happened to your luggage? Why didn't you change clothes?" And Evo Morales said, I can't bring any luggage. I can't risk that because the police could simply slip in some drugs or precursor chemicals, and there's a long list of precursor chemicals for which you can be sent to jail, and it could be years before your case is even heard. So that's a way to make him disappear effectively for several years. He understands how this system can be abused.
It was also interesting that when he was faced with these marchers, I mean, he accused the police in one stage of trying to foment a coup, said that the marchers were trying to destabilize the government. He's in a unique position of having to balance all these different things, right? And it's not a position I envy. Kathryn, you know, when we talk about Bolivia being a divided society, etc., I mean, we heard there in that interview at the beginning of the program with Pablo Solon that there is a huge income disparity, there is huge inequality. What is Evo Morales doing to close that gap, to narrow that?
Well, I think that there are several things that are going on. One of the things is that, you know, Bolivia is enjoying a boon from hydrocarbons and minerals, increased taxes since the beginning of his administration and even before. There have been efforts to do the direct transfers that Eric has spoken to that are very, very popular because it's a concrete, palpable benefit, something that people can hold in their hand. But when we talk about high expectations and what can be done with this money and the goals that the Morales administration has set to totally rework the political system, have a new constitution, rework the judiciary, create a whole new series and bodies of laws, it's a lot on their plate. And it's something that takes a long time. And while you may be solving some problems and reforming things, you're also generating these gray areas which can also foment conflict. It's very complicated when you talk about Morales's role and his responsibility or the efforts that he makes for indigenous people, because who is an indigenous person in Bolivia? It's a very heterogeneous group. Coca growers are indigenous people, Aymaras and Quechuas generally. There are different visions of land use conflicts between and among indigenous peoples that mean that, you know, a Morales program to benefit indigenous people is not very straightforward. And you have the MAS coalition is a pre-electoral coalition of many different social movements and indigenous groups and others and unions that often have contradictory demands. So these cycles of conflict, of protest, are things that are recurring. We may up the volume, they may slow down, but it's a constant process in which the state is forced to be accountable to the Bolivian populace. And there's a good side to that and there's a bad side. And I think that goes back to Sanho's comment on the very unique position Morales is in. He's kind of put himself in a sandwich.
Yeah. And Eric, when we look at that accountability that Kathryn's talking about and these recent events, what are the dangers politically for Evo Morales?
Well, the dangers are that this spirals out of control. I'm not predicting that necessarily, but I think it is a danger because as you have different sectors continue to sequentially move forward into protest or to aggravate in some way, you get the impression, perhaps, that Bolivia is an unsettled society. And at some point, people are going to not have their demands met, and then they're going to react. And the question is, how do they react? Do they react and accept it, like some of the police officers we heard earlier in the report, and resign themselves to that? Or do they try to take steps to increase their benefits or that sort of thing? But I think the ultimate answer is not that the state can be or even should be responsible for everybody in the context of their economic well-being. I mean, that's a model that's been rejected by Brazil and other neighbors in South America and Latin America. The state has an important role, there's no question about that. But until and unless you begin to develop job creation in Bolivia of good jobs, not just mining jobs, which are not bad jobs, but jobs that add value and based on innovation, based on education, based on a modern society, Bolivia is always going to be the poorest country in South America, and that's not a level I don't think that anybody really aspires to. So there is a long-term project that needs to be undertaken, and it goes well beyond, I think, some of the immediate crises, and really goes to the heart of what sort of an economy is Bolivia going to be over the longer term.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Time has caught up with us. Kathryn, Eric, Sanho, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. And that is it from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And of course, we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching.